There is a specific kind of failure that history finds harder to explain than defeat in battle. Not the failure of a commander who was outmatched, outnumbered, or surprised. The failure of a commander who knew exactly what was coming, had the tools to respond, and did nothing. December 8, 1941, in the Philippines, is that kind of failure. At 3:40 in the morning, General Douglas MacArthur was awakened by a phone call. Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States was at war. MacArthur had 35 B-17 flying fortresses at Clark Field, the largest concentration of heavy bombers outside the continental United States. He had radar. He had fighter cover. He had 9 hours before the Japanese could reach him from their bases in Formosa. At 12:35 in the afternoon, the Japanese arrived. The B-17s were on the ground, fully fueled, neatly parked wingtip to wingtip. No camouflage, no dispersal, no air raid shelters for the ground crews. When the bombs started falling, the teletype operator who had received the radar warning of the incoming Japanese formation was out to lunch. By the time the Japanese left an hour later, MacArthur had lost half his air force. What followed was 3 years of Japanese occupation, the Bataan Death March, and the fall of the Philippines, the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. The commanders who lost their aircraft at Pearl Harbor were relieved of command and investigated in 8 separate official inquiries. There has never been a single official investigation of what happened at Clark Field. MacArthur received the Medal of Honor. I keep coming back to that 9-hour window. Not to assign blame, history has spent 80 years doing that without resolution. What interests me is the specific mechanism by which a man of MacArthur's intelligence, experience, and ambition received the clearest possible warning and produced the least possible response. Because the answer isn't incompetence. It's something more complicated and more instructive than that. To understand what happened at Clark Field, you need to understand what MacArthur believed about the Philippines in the fall of 1941, because his decisions on December 8th were the logical product of a strategic assessment that had been building for months. Douglas MacArthur had served in the Philippines 3 times over a career that spanned 4 decades. He had commanded troops in combat in World War I, earning 13 Silver Stars. He had been superintendent of West Point. He had been Army Chief of Staff from 1930 to 1935, the highest military position in the United States. He had retired from the U.S. Army in 1937 to serve as Field Marshal of the Philippine Commonwealth Army, a title and a role that reflected his belief that the Philippines were worth defending and that he was the man to defend them. In July 1941, with war looming across the Pacific, Roosevelt recalled him to active duty and gave him command of U.S. Army forces in the Far East. MacArthur became responsible for the defense of the Philippines, with a force that was, by any honest accounting, inadequate to the task. What changed his assessment was the arrival of the B-17s, 35 Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, with a range of nearly 1,000 miles, represented something that no previous Philippine defense plan had possessed: the ability to strike at Japanese bases before a Japanese invasion fleet could reach Philippine shores. MacArthur had lobbied Washington for these aircraft specifically. When they arrived in the fall of 1941, his view of the Philippines' strategic position shifted dramatically. He believed, and communicated this belief to Washington in writing, that the Philippines could be held, and that the B-17s were the instrument that made it possible. Washington, partly persuaded by MacArthur's optimism, increased the priority of Philippine reinforcement. More aircraft were scheduled to arrive. MacArthur was building something real. That investment, psychological as much as strategic, shaped everything that followed on December 8th. MacArthur's air commander, Major General Lewis Brereton, understood the B-17 as an offensive weapon. When news of Pearl Harbor arrived at 3:40 in the morning, Brereton's first thought was not defense. It was attack. The Japanese attack planes on Formosa were grounded by fog. Their bases were within range of the B-17s at Clark Field. A preemptive strike in the early morning hours might catch Japanese bombers on the ground before the fog lifted. The same situation in reverse that would destroy MacArthur's force 5 hours later. The symmetry of the opportunity, and the irony of what followed, is one of the most documented and least explained episodes in Pacific War history. Brereton drove to MacArthur's headquarters at approximately 5 a.m. to request authorization for a strike against Formosa. MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Brigadier General Richard Sutherland, turned him away. MacArthur was not available. No explanation was given for why the commander of U.S. Army forces in the Far East, on the first morning of a war with Japan, 9 hours after Pearl Harbor, was not available to his air commander at 5 o'clock in the morning. Brereton returned to his own headquarters and ordered the B-17 armed and prepared, waiting for authorization that hadn't come. He called MacArthur's headquarters again at 7:15 in the morning. Again, he was told to stand by. Around this time, General Hap Arnold, Chief of the Army Air Forces, called Brereton directly from Washington with a single purpose: to warn him not to repeat Pearl Harbor. Don't let your planes get caught on the ground. Brereton relayed the warning through his own chain of command. MacArthur's headquarters received it. At some point in the morning, the exact timing is disputed and has never been fully resolved, MacArthur called Brereton and told him that the B-17s could be used for reconnaissance, but not for offensive operations. The reasoning was that MacArthur believed he was under orders not to initiate hostilities, even after Pearl Harbor. He was waiting for explicit authorization from Washington to go on the offensive. That authorization never came in the form he apparently required. What makes this reasoning extraordinary is the context. Pearl Harbor had been attacked. The United States was at war. A specific message from Washington had told MacArthur to implement War Plan Rainbow 5, which was not a defensive plan. It was an offensive plan that explicitly called for offensive operations against Japan in the event of war. MacArthur had been reminded of this directive just days before. He did not implement it. At 10:14 in the morning, MacArthur finally authorized a strike against Formosa. By then, the fog over the Japanese bases had lifted hours earlier. The Japanese planes were already airborne and had been flying for over an hour. The B-17s that Brereton had sent up earlier to keep them out of harm's way were returning to Clark Field to refuel. As they landed, ground crews began arming them for the authorized strike mission. B-17 pilots who had been on continuous alert since 3:40 in the morning were eating lunch. Fighters that had been airborne through the morning were coming down to refuel. The base was in the most vulnerable state it had been in all morning. Aircraft on the ground, crews not at their stations. The alert posture that had been maintained for hours now relaxed, at the one moment it mattered most. At 11:30, the radar station at Iba detected the Japanese formation 130 miles out. The warning was transmitted to Clark Field. At noon, Clark Field received the warning directly by teletype. The teletype operator was out to lunch. At 12:10, the cameras for a planned photo reconnaissance mission were being loaded onto a B-17. At 12:35, the Japanese arrived. The attack came in two waves. The first wave, 26 high-altitude bombers at 20,000 feet, dropped 636 bombs across Clark Field in a single pass. The second wave was 0 fighters coming in low, strafing whatever the bombs had left intact. The attack lasted just over an hour. When it was over, 15 of the 19 B-17 at Clark were destroyed or severely damaged. 34 P-40 fighters were gone. 55 men were dead. 110 were wounded. At Iba Field, 42 miles away, the attack was simultaneous. 24 P-40s and 4 P-35s were destroyed. Most of the pilots who had been airborne and returned to refuel died when the field was bombed while they were on the ground. General Hap Arnold's question, the one that has never been satisfactorily answered, was direct. How in hell could an experienced airman get caught with his planes on the ground 9 hours after Pearl Harbor? Arnold wrote in his memoirs in 1949 that he had never been able to get the real story of what happened in the Philippines. He died the following year without getting it. Subscribe now to keep following these stories, the decisions that history records but rarely explains. New video every week. Now we continue. The aftermath of Clark Field accelerated a collapse that might have been inevitable, but was made catastrophic by the loss of air cover. Japan controlled the skies over the Philippines from December 8th onward. Without air cover, the naval base at Cavite, the primary American naval installation in the Pacific outside Pearl Harbor, was destroyed by Japanese bombers on December 10th. 17 torpedo warheads exploded in the base's ordnance depot. The Asiatic fleet lost its forward base and withdrew south. Without air or naval support, the ground defense of Luzon became a question not of whether it would fail, but of how long it could be delayed. MacArthur withdrew his forces to the Bataan Peninsula, declaring Manila an open city on December 26th to spare it from bombardment. The plan was to hold Bataan until reinforcements arrived. The reinforcements were never coming. Washington had already decided, in the first weeks of the war, that the Pacific conflict would be fought from Australia and the Central Pacific, not from the Philippines. The men on Bataan, 80,000 American and Filipino soldiers, understood this before their commanders told them. They gave themselves a name, the Battling Bastards of Bataan. A poem circulated in the ranks. No mama, no papa, no Uncle Sam. No aunts, no uncles, no cousins, no niece. No pills, no planes, no artillery pieces. And nobody gives a damn. On half rations by January, short on medicine, ammunition, and any prospect of relief, the defenders of Bataan held out for 4 months. It was one of the most tenacious defensive actions in American military history. It was also, by the end, a death sentence for the men who fought it. Roosevelt ordered MacArthur to leave in late February 1942, evacuating him by PT boat through Japanese-controlled waters to Mindanao, then by B-17 to Australia. His famous declaration upon arrival, "I came through and I shall return," was made from the relative safety of Australia, while his men continued to fight on Bataan without relief, without resupply, and without any realistic prospect of either. Bataan fell on April 9, 1942. What followed was the Bataan Death March. Between 60,000 and 80,000 prisoners of war, forced to walk 65 miles in tropical heat to prison camps in the interior. Guards beat men who fell behind. Men who could not continue were executed at the roadside or left to die. Between 5,000 and 18,000 Filipino and American soldiers died on the march itself. Thousands more died in the camps in the months that followed, from disease, starvation, and violence. The final American stronghold, Corregidor Island at the mouth of Manila Bay, fell on May 6, 1942. General Jonathan Wainwright, who had taken command when MacArthur left, surrendered the last American forces in the Philippines. It was the largest surrender of American-led forces in history. The man who had controlled those 9 hours on December 8th was in Australia when Corregidor fell, reorganizing the Allied forces that would eventually fight their way back. He returned in October 1944, waiting ashore at Leyte with photographers present, fulfilling his promise in an image that became one of the most reproduced photographs of the entire war. He accepted the Japanese surrender on the deck of the USS Missouri on September 2, 1945. He was appointed Supreme Commander for the Allied powers in Japan and oversaw the occupation with an authority that no American general had exercised over a defeated nation before or since. None of that changes what happened between 3:40 and 12:35 on December 8, 1941. The official inquiry that never happened has been replaced by decades of historical argument. The blame has landed in different places. Some historians point to MacArthur's paralysis, a failure mode that resembles what overtook Stalin in the hours after Barbarossa. The inability of a commander to process an event that contradicted his entire strategic framework. Some point to Washington's failure to provide unambiguous orders in the critical hours of the morning. Some point to the command structure that required Brereton to go through Sutherland to reach MacArthur, a layer of insulation that cost hours that didn't exist. The contrast with the aftermath of Pearl Harbor is instructive and uncomfortable. Admiral Kimmel and General Short, the commanders in Hawaii, were relieved of command within 10 days of the attack. They were investigated in 8 separate official inquiries over the following 5 years. Both spent the rest of their lives under the shadow of official blame. Both had been surprised, tactically, if not strategically. Both had failed to act on warning signs. Neither had 9 hours of advance notice. MacArthur had 9 hours. He received the Medal of Honor in March 1942, 4 months after Clark Field, while his men were fighting and dying on Bataan. The historian D. Clayton James, whose 3-volume biography of MacArthur remains the most comprehensive account of his career, described the morning of December 8th as the single most inexplicable episode in MacArthur's professional life. A man who had spent 30 years building one of the most carefully constructed military reputations in American history, produced, in those 9 hours, a record that he spent the rest of his life trying to explain away, and never fully explained. MacArthur's own memoir, Reminiscences, published in 1964, dealt with Clark Field in a single paragraph. He claimed he had ordered the B-17s dispersed to Mindanao days before the attack. No documentation from 1941 supports this claim. He claimed the attack was a surprise. It was not. Radar tracked the incoming Japanese formation for over an hour before it arrived. He claimed the mission under his command was defensive, not offensive. His orders from Washington explicitly stated otherwise. What the historical record shows is something more uncomfortable than a straightforward lie. It shows a man who received clear warning, had clear tools, understood the stakes, and produced a morning of institutional paralysis that has resisted 80 years of historical explanation. The failure at Clark Field doesn't fit neatly into any of the categories history uses to process military disaster. It wasn't cowardice. MacArthur's personal courage under fire was documented across 4 decades of service. It wasn't incompetence. He was one of the most capable strategic minds the American military produced in the 20th century. It was something that sits between those categories and refuses the labels. What it most resembles is the failure mode of commanders who are so invested in a particular version of reality that they cannot revise it in real time, even when the revision is urgent and the cost of not revising is catastrophic. MacArthur had spent months constructing a case, to Washington, to the Philippine government, and to himself, that the islands could be held, that the B-17s were the instrument that made it possible, and that he was the commander who would do what every previous Philippine defense plan had said was impossible. December 8, 1941, required him to abandon that case in the space of a single morning, to accept that the offensive capability he had lobbied for and received was going to be destroyed before it demonstrated anything, to act in a way that contradicted everything he had promised Washington he would do. He didn't act. The clocks ran down on 9 hours that couldn't be recovered. The planes burned on the ground, and the men who paid the price for those 9 hours marched to their deaths on a road 65 miles long, in the heat of a Philippine April, 3 years before the man who had commanded their fate waited ashore at Leyte to fulfill his promise. An analysis of how decisions made under extreme pressure determine the outcome of conflicts, and what we can learn from them today.